Within minutes after the killing of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE agent, the Trump administration, including Donald Trump, began an all-out campaign to describe her as a domestic terrorist without providing the public with any evidence to support that claim. When asked to clarify why Secretary Noem jumped to that conclusion so quickly, Secretary Noem doubled down on the comments she made, again, with no evidence provided to back them up. Watch.
You said that she was a domestic terrorist. How do you define domestic terrorist?
She weaponized her vehicle to conduct an act of violence against a law enforcement officer and the public. They are doing that.
How can you assert with certainty that she was trying to hurt the officer as opposed to she was trying to flee the scene?
If you look at what the definition of domestic terrorism is, it completely fits the situation on the ground.
That's not true, but we should also note that analysis of the video shows that Renee Nicole Good was steering away. She had turned the tires away from the officer before he opened fire. Noem's definition of domestic terrorism, quote, an act of violence against a law enforcement officer, actually came back to bite her in the rear end later in that very interview. Watch.
I want to show some video to you right now and ask, what is the appropriate response for the police officers in this situation? Those are law enforcement officers being physically attacked. By this standard, would any of those officers be justified in shooting and killing the people causing them physical harm?
Every single situation is going to rely on the situation those officers are on. That they know that when people are putting hands on them, when they are using weapons against them, when they are physically harming them, that they have the authority to arrest those individuals.
The president pardoned every single one of those people.
And make sure that they're getting justice for their actions going forward.
President Trump pardoned every single one of those people.
And every single one of these investigations comes in the full context of the situation on the ground. And that's one thing that President Trump has been so focused on, is making sure that when we're out there, we don't pick and choose which situations are and which laws are enforced and which ones aren't.
I just showed you video of people attacking law enforcement officers. Undisputed proof, undisputed evidence. And I just said President Trump pardoned all of them. And you said that President Trump is enforcing all the laws equally. It's just not true.
I can't cover her without sort of injecting what she's told us about her own personal character. The sadistic act of shooting her own dog is something she writes about in her own book. So that's who's running all of this as a starting point.
Well, she's not really running anything. Let's be real. She is a complete puppet. And Corey Lewandowski is running the Department of Homeland Security. Actually, he's following directions of Stephen Miller, who is running it. And there's no question that she can't even put a coherent sentence together to respond to those questions because she doesn't actually understand the things that she's saying. Obviously, even if she drove her car directly at the officer, that's not domestic terrorism. But what you said is exactly right, which is, first of all, if she wanted to use her car as a weapon, why did she back up? And then why was she clearly turning the steering wheel? But what really is remarkable here is they've made up their mind. They made up their mind before seeing many of the videos. And they already concluded, from Trump to Noem to J.D. Vance to Stephen Miller, that this guy was acting within his rights to shoot her 3 times, shoot a moving vehicle, which is against all law enforcement training, and shoot her 3 times in the head and kill her. And yet now we're supposed to believe that the FBI is going to do an independent investigation and that they're actually, of course not. That is garbage. They are sweeping this under the rug, as they do with anything that is politically damaging to them. And then they'll focus on, as we were just talking about, Jerome Powell or anybody Donald Trump doesn't like. It is the definition of unequal prosecution. And what part of the problem is the law, which is why I'm introducing a bill that would change qualified immunity for that officer, because it is true that if the officer subjectively believes that he was at risk, and there's a broad standard that, you know, in the blink of an eye, do you know yes or no, then he is immune from liability. So I'm trying to change it to an objective standard, which is to say a reasonable officer in that situation, what should they have done? Because in some cases, yes, they should have qualified immunity. But in this particular case, where you have these rogue officers in masks, totally militarized, absolutely demonizing and terrorizing cities and communities all around the country, separate and apart from whether they're immigrant communities or not. Americans, Renee Good is an American, and this is what they are bringing. You know, you talk about Venezuela, like this is what a dictator rules with secret police that are indiscriminately killing people, that he's telling oil companies he's going into Venezuela before he tells Congress, like the oligarchs in Russia. He's using our criminal justice system as a political tool. That is the #1 lesson that we give to other countries around the world about the step one for democracy. I mean, just look at what is going on. It is Vladimir Putin's playbook that Donald Trump is following, and he has all of these lackeys who are just doing his bidding for him, and it's disgraceful, and it's going to cause real damage to this country, to our own national security. Let's be real. This is not something like it's just going to stay in Venezuela or overseas. Yeah. It's going to come back, and it's going to bite us in the ass. I
mean, that's the subject of some of your recent reporting about how the FBI and the DOJ have been essentially gutted, and decades of experience in counterterrorism, counter cyber, counter sex trafficking, counter drug cartels. All that expertise has been purged because those happen to be the people, I think, that you were referencing at the top of the hour who believe in the rule of law.
Yeah, look, half of SDNY is working on document production for Epstein. Senior leaders in major U.S. attorneys' offices across the country are working on the president's political prosecutions. The Times just broke the story earlier today that the #2 in EDVA, as the congressman was pointing out, just quit or was fired over his lack of whatever. The hollowing out of the Justice Department is, I think, a politically risky thing, because the first basic question whenever anything happens is, what did the FBI and Justice Department know, and what did they do? And look, Donald Trump is playing with a lot of different volatile things, whether it's on the international stage, or if it's domestically, or if it's economically. And so far, the consequences for him politically, while I'm sure people will point to his approval ratings, have not been catastrophic.
Well, he hasn't been impeached, but he is more unpopular than he was during COVID.
Fair. But if you're playing with all of these really important things in highly unusual ways, in ways that we haven't seen recent precedents, I just think he's exposing himself.
And exposing
the country. Yeah. But he has an ability to persevere through these types of things in ways that certainly other politicians don't.
I mean, and I guess that's the bottom line. I mean, when does sort of the rule of law snap back? Does it?
I hope it does. I think the first thing is, though, with someone like Kristi Noem, she needs to be under oath being asked questions.
Before the congressman, yeah.
Before Congress and answering questions, because she said a number of things during that interview that were not only against protocol, like why is she said to Jake Tapper she was talking to the officers, that she was the one talking to the supervisors afterwards. Like, that's not what you would expect the secretary to do. That's OIG or DOJ. Yeah. Like, she has no law enforcement experience. And then she believed, based on those conversations, she knew the truth.
And she has no idea. And then said it publicly. It's all bananas. Thank you for being here. Keep coming back.
Always.
Top story tonight is the news upending Trump's embattled DOJ and driving outrage against Trump in the powerful corridors of Wall Street. Trump's largely admitted agenda of abusing power to investigate, even indict those who exercise their right to stand up to him, an effort which has probed and indicted several major figures, including the flailing or failed cases against FBI vet Comey and New York Attorney General James, now includes another target, as the Trump administration has been outed for this news, launching an unusual criminal probe into an official who's clashed with Trump for years, you may recall, Federal Reserve Chair Powell. That's driving these headlines today. Powell joins this list of people who are, remember, diverse in their backgrounds, party affiliation, and all kinds of other factors. Indeed, what they have in common on the enemies list that Trump's own aides promised, some of them under oath, not to pursue, all they have in common is they've exercised their rights to stand up to Trump. And Powell's entire job is to run independent policy, not bow to any politician's demands. Not President Biden, who he served before, not Trump in his first term, etc. That's why the Fed's independent. By doing that job independently, he's clearly upset Trump, just as President Trump cracked down on officials that we showed you, like Comey or his former appointee Bolton. Powell responding now by directly accusing Trump of abusing this threat of criminal charges to interfere with the Fed's independent work.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do, with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people.
That's the rare video statement pushing back. The details about this new Trump DOJ case sound almost comically thin. They don't involve any obvious misconduct or financial matters or some personal matter or crime alleged. Instead, they have Powell testifying, something you're supposed to do in the job, and whether he was 100% accurate in testimony about the scope of a long-running renovation of the Fed building. Powell's adamant that that topic itself, the whole thing, is a lie, is a fake pretext. He said as much in the statement in a different part. Trump's also used similar types of claims to go after another member of the Fed, in her case just trying to say there was some sort of financial malfeasance and then oust her over that, which she doesn't really probably have the power to do, but it's all the way going up to the Supreme Court. Trump also happened to tour the renovations now being discussed. This was last summer. He toured them with Powell.
It looks like it's about $3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed. You just added in a third building is what that is. That's a third building.
Well, no, but it's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago. We finished Martin 5 years ago.
It's part of the overall work.
But it's
So
not new.
You can see there the kind of fact-checking that the president's not accustomed to in person, maybe didn't like. But the issue here with Trump is he's now claiming he doesn't even know about this probe. He is denying it, which is a reminder that this probe is suspicious enough, bad enough, that the president doesn't want to be tied to it. But allies of Powell, independent experts, even some Republican members of Congress find that hard to believe. And remember, we have a system where sometimes the government is given a certain amount of deference in life, in law, in policy. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out numbers, in normal times, we take those, we might analyze them, sometimes fact-check them, but there's some deference. Donald Trump has blown up any such deference. And so it is not an ideological or political matter when someone lies this much, this frequently about these topics, that he is now finding that even Republicans, let alone the rest of the reality-based community, don't give him deference. They don't believe that this is the legitimate reason for the probe. And Trump's admitted abuse of federal probes against others adds to that picture, and how this probe may be tainted by Trump's political appointee, Jeanine Pirro, former Fox host, overseeing it. There's another Trump loyalist also involved. Bill Pulte serves as the, quote, attack dog on Powell and other Trump targets like Letitia James. He is now under scrutiny for using his power to try to build the groundwork for 4 different probes that we know of. In fact, showing that he thinks he can weigh in on this, he has a different job. He's not at DOJ. He even posted about how I believe whoever the president names chair will be excellent and Powell will soon be gone. Powell's Fed chairmanship does set to expire this year, but he has several more years on the Fed. And this individual, Pulte, seemed very comfortable posting about it. Now, again, this may be a tell in the same way that Trump guiltily doesn't want anything to do with this sort of news today. Now Pulte says he can't discuss this even after discussing it before.
Why is Trump's DOJ investigating Chairman Powell? Is this all politics?
That's outside. This whole thing is outside of my purview, Maria, so I'd refer you to the DOJ on that matter.
If it's outside of his purview, he better tell his own Twitter. The DOJ does not have credibility under Trump and Bondi. That may be a sad fact. It may complicate cases where we do want to look at what the government says and take it seriously. But these revenge cases, some of them dismissed, some of them dropped, some of them awaiting trial, several of them involving subpoenas flying around, indicting a congressional candidate, they have hit already a ton of setbacks. We've added Powell today to the lower right corner. The abuse of legal powers here are not occurring in a vacuum either. I have to remind you tonight, as you may know, that Trump DOJ's attacks on these senior officials in a sort of orderly fashion, if you want to call it that, a kind of a bureaucratic autocracy in Washington, run alongside something much more extreme, the sometimes lethal use of force by Trump administration agents on the streets, which drew those big protests this weekend, and we have more on that later tonight. Some Wall Street and Republican figures also see a red line crossed today with Powell, which is why we can report within this quick span of time more pushback than on certain other matters, including, for example, how people are treated in the streets by ICE. Now, that partly may be because he is so key to the economy, so he just touches a lot of other things, and they already know that. For many others in these elite circles, it may be that they see him as a more relatable or sympathetic target. A 72-year-old establishment figure who holds this job because he was first elevated to the Fed by President Trump in his first term. He is someone who has stated facts and disagreed with the president, but he is literally an early Trump appointee and was renewed by President Biden in that now decaying tradition where you hold over certain people because they are in the job, not necessarily because you've already vetted them politically. So if some on Wall Street or in these elite Republican circles see this tonight as a red line, there is a dark echo here for autocratic times if you know your history. When they came for the immigrants, I didn't stand up. I wasn't an immigrant. When they came for the protesters, I didn't stand up. I wasn't protesting. But when they came for the Trump appointee chair of the Federal Reserve and all the money coursing through Wall Street, well, now some elites are standing up. Republican Senator Tillis, using his key role on these issues, because he has a banking role, they're in oversight in the Senate to push back. He says it's clear now the Trump administration wants to end the independence of the Fed. He says in this statement that Trump and Bondi's DOJ are actually the entity that faces questions over independence and credibility. And Tillis is going beyond just typing. He has vowed now through his role to fight Trump on the whole plot and the effort to reshape the Fed, saying, we'll see if he does this, but going farther than some Republicans, saying he will oppose any more nominees by Trump to the Fed, resisting any effort to change the composition of the Fed until the DOJ resolves or backs down on this probe, which Tillis says is purely an abuse of power. So on the one hand, wow, so Republican actually standing up. And not just saying, hey, we got to put pressure and watch the courts and do all the things we hear from elites in D.C. He's actually using the power he has and saying, I get it. You want to control the Fed. Congress has a say. We're not going to let you put anybody on here if you keep up with this BS. That's what he's saying. We'll see if he lives up to it. But on the other hand, I just reminded you that they're shooting people in the face in the streets. And they've indicted all those people I showed you on that chart. So if it takes Powell to wake you up, okay. And if it takes the next one to wake you up, fine. And if it takes too long to wake up, well, you won't be awake to fight when they take all of it away.
Breaking tonight, new details on the very first boat strike off the coast of Venezuela last fall. That raised further questions over its legality. The New York Times reporting the Pentagon used a secret aircraft painted to look like a civilian plane in its first attack on a boat that the Trump administration said was smuggling drugs, killing 11 people last September, according to officials briefed on the matter. The aircraft also carried its munitions inside the fuselage rather than visibly under its wings. The laws of armed conflict forbid combatants from feigning civilian status to fool adversaries into dropping their guard, then attacking and killing them. That is a war crime called perfidy. Joining us now, Todd Huntley, director of the National Security Law Program at the Georgetown University Law Center and a retired Navy captain. And Rachel Van Landingham, a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. She is a professor of law at Southwestern Law School, Los Angeles. Both served as active duty judge advocates.
Greetings to you both. Because you were active duty judge advocates, that means you know the law. So maybe you can break some of this down for us. Let's read a little more from the reporting from the New York Times tonight. The aircraft swooped in low enough for the people aboard the boat to see it, according to officials who have seen and been briefed on surveillance video from the attack. The boat had turned back toward Venezuela, apparently, after seeing the plane before the first strike. Two survivors of the initial attack later appeared to wave at the aircraft after clambering aboard an overturned piece of the hull before the military killed them in a follow-up strike that also sank the wreckage. It is not clear whether the initial survivors knew that the explosion on their vessel had been caused by a missile attack. MS now has not independently confirmed this reporting yet, but Professor Huntley, the reading of this feels very concerning.
Yes, it is. It's very concerning. Again, one of the fundamental principles in the law of armed conflict is that you cannot use a protected status to gain a military advantage with the intent to kill or wound the enemy. That is one of the earliest things that we are taught as judge advocates when studying the law of armed conflict. And it's so basic that it's hard to believe that that was missed.
Yeah. I tell you, Professor Landingham, it just, in one sense, it's not hard to believe that it was done, though, because we've seen this administration go to extraordinary lengths in the past. And there are two thoughts that cross my mind on this story. The first is there's a reason why the international community is very, very clear, and certainly our laws are very, very clear about committing perfidy, this idea of disguising military craft to look like civilian aircraft. Very simple reason. You don't want the other side to suddenly start taking out U.S. airplanes with Americans on board, right? That's a common sense thing. We don't want you to confuse, a U.S. aircraft that's just taken off from National or from LaGuardia, right, with some type of military aircraft. So that's one thing. But the other part of it for me is what then are the consequences here? What are the possible ramifications in the international as well as the U.S. legal community, if this evidence comes further to light, and there's either a pattern of doing this or whatever else may be found from it?
Thank you, Michael. You're absolutely right. I mean, this is a longstanding fundamental tenet, principle, rule of the law of war, and it's because we want our own civilians to be protected. And war divides the world between civilians who are supposed to be protected and military members who sacrifice themselves in their nation's name, right? And so when you blow those things up or combine them, that means civilians are now targets. But let's be real here. We're already in Alice in Wonderland because there was no war here. That first boat strike, the second boat strike, the 28th boat strike are strikes of murder because there is no non-international armed conflict like the administration supposedly claims, because we have yet to see the classified legal memo justifying any of this. So we're not under the law of war. So there is no perfidy. It's just all murder. But if we're going to believe the administration, that we actually are in an armed conflict by failing to adhere to what looks like failing to adhere to the fundamental principle not to engage in perfidy, not to pretend to be a civilian aircraft in order to kill people. That means we're weakening everybody's adherence to that and the trust that we have amongst the international community when we go around training armed forces around the world. Hey, follow these laws. They're good rules. They help keep our society safe and us safe. Why would anyone believe us?
Professor Huntley, I think Professor Van Landingham is getting it exactly right there and not letting us miss the forest for the trees. Because if you dig into the reporting, there are 3 sources who tell the New York Times, okay, yes, it wasn't painted the way it ordinarily should have been painted to denote that it was a military vehicle. But we want you to know the transponder was transmitting a military tail number so that it could be identified via radio signals. But if the boats do not have the equipment necessary to pick up that radio signal, then does that count? And is what I am understanding from Professor Van Landingham is like all of this would have need to be signed off on by someone, right? There isn't a lawyer who looked at all of this. And if they weren't fundamentally concerned with the baseline rationale, then all of these details, like how the plane is communicating, whether or not is a military aircraft, that all in some ways, while absolutely important, becomes secondary to the bigger point, which is you have not set the legal predicate for war.
No, you're right. And Rachel is spot on. And, thinking back to my time advising commanders on operations, this is, again, something that, you should have caught. But this happens because when the Secretary of Defense, calls jag-offs and tries to ignore or just go around their advice, this is what happens. There are legitimate uses for planes like this, for surveillance, for gaining access to denied areas in some cases. But anybody who was reviewing this, any JAG reviewing this, would have then said, yes, we can now use a different platform, right? If you need the surveillance capabilities of this specific aircraft, then if we're going to carry out a lethal operation, we bring in a different platform that is clearly a military platform. But in, again, ignoring JAGs, going around experienced legal advisors, that's lost. And I have to wonder if this particular aircraft wasn't chosen to conduct a strike because it's a cool toy, right? It's something that is new. And so, it's lethal, as the SecDef would say. And so it was chosen despite the very clear legal issues that arise from its use in this manner.
Well, that leads me to a couple questions then, Professor Van Landingham. One, is this why they don't want to release the video? Because of what the people who have seen the video are now describing to the New York Times? And then secondly, to the point you made earlier, the broader point about where this all comes from, how there is no war, we do remember that the whole pretext about Venezuela came from like a PR team in Florida. You remember in Aurora, Colorado, when they said it was being overrun by Tren de Agua? That was a made-up thing by a PR firm in Colorado for the building that was having issues. They weren't keeping up with their tenants, and the president jumped on it. And we've now gotten to blowing up boats in the Caribbean and capturing the president of Venezuela from a made-up thing. It's insane.
It is quite a bit made up, except for the fact that that president of Venezuela is,
he's a bad guy.
Leader of it is a bad guy. Yeah. But I go back to the alleged failure to adhere to fundamental law of war. If we're going to tell our service members we're in a war, even though we're not in a war, but if we're going to tell them we're at war, we also tell them that you can look your spouses in the eye, you can look your children in the eye once you come home from that war, because you're fighting honorably by adhering to the law. So if we're going to see destruction of law up here, we're now seeing it down here, and that affects every single service member in uniform today, because it's the commander-in-chief's job, and all commanders on down, to preserve the moral compass, right, to keep it on true north for their service members. So by playing fast and loose with the law at the fundamental level, we're not really at war, and we are in a pretend war, but we're not going to follow the laws of war anyway. What is that doing to our service members? There's moral corrosion going on here, and that's incredibly sad and shameful, in addition to the lives that are being lost through these murders.
Let's bring in MS Now Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian, MS Now White House reporter Akayla Gardner, former federal prosecutor Barrett Berger, and University of Michigan professor of economics and public policy Justin Wolfers. Ken, what more do we know about this investigation? What are the subpoenas for? What are the potential crimes, et cetera?
Good morning, Anna. Well, MS Now has confirmed that this investigation is being run out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. as a special project. And in that unusual and hard-hitting video released last night, Chairman Powell said that the subpoenas threatened a criminal indictment related to his testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. And part of that testimony was about a $2.5 billion ongoing renovation of the historic Federal Reserve headquarters in downtown Washington, D.C. And in that testimony, Powell tried to push back on what he sees as misinformation about that project. Take a listen.
There's no VPI dining room. There's no new marble. We took down the old marble. We're putting it back up. We'll have to use new marble where some of the old marble broke, but there's no new. There are no special elevators. They're old elevators that have been there. There are no new water features. There's no beehives, and there's no roof terrace gardens. Other than that, so all of the sort of inflammatory things that the media carried are either not in the current plan or just inaccurate.
Now, we don't know exactly what prosecutors believe that Powell may have misstated in that testimony, but we do know, based on the now dismissed indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, that this Justice Department is willing to bring what legal experts believe are specious and thin cases involving lying to Congress. To prove a lying charge, you don't just have to have a misstatement or a contradiction in testimony. You have to have evidence that someone acted with corrupt intent, that they meant to lie. It remains to be seen whether they have any of that evidence in this case or whether this investigation even will result in charges, Anna. But we can tell from what the stock market is doing right now that they see this as a threat to the Fed's independence.
So, Ken, you said this is run as part of a special projects team. What do we know about that team?
Not much in terms of detail, Anna, except that Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. attorney in D.C., has signed off on this. It's not clear how personally involved she is. She's been seen by a lot of observers as sort of the grown-up in the room at this Justice Department. But this case is really raising a lot of eyebrows as a potential another example of weaponization of the Justice Department, Anna.
Barrett, what is your initial reaction?
Yeah, I mean, cases involving lying to Congress are pretty rare, and that's for good reason, because they're really hard to prove. Ken hit the nail on the head when he said, you have to show that the witness made these misstatements or omissions knowingly, that they actually were seeking to mislead somebody. But in addition to that, prosecutors would also have to show that they were material. You can't just, hang somebody up on something that is just a trivial detail. The misstatement or the lie has to actually matter to the listener. It has to actually have some sort of influence on them. They're very hard to bring, as Ken pointed out. We saw in the case of James Comey, not only are these cases hard to bring, they're also wildly unpopular. I think if people get the sense that the Justice Department is being used as political leverage here, right, that this is being used all in an effort to influence the Fed, I think there will be pushback. We've started seeing pushback from Congress. You might see pushback on the side of the courts, and you'll certainly see pushback in the markets, I would imagine.
Kayla, we've seen this president repeatedly try to pressure Powell publicly over interest rates. We've seen him call Powell names over and over again. What is President Trump saying now in response to this news breaking? And do we know how this case progressed behind the scenes? Because there have been a number of investigations against Trump antagonists.
Well, President Trump overnight said he knew nothing about the Justice Department's investigation into the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, but just 2 weeks ago, he said the opposite.
We're thinking about bringing a suit against Powell for incompetence, because think of it, these aren't outstanding buildings, these are small buildings. These are $4 billion more. It's going to end up costing more than $4 billion. $4 billion. It's the highest price of construction. So we're thinking about bringing a gross incompetence, what's called gross incompetence lawsuit. It's gross incompetence against Powell.
Well, Anna, this moment in history is really months in the making. We've seen President Trump repeatedly call for Powell to resign. We've seen him suggest that he could fire him, but then walk back from those statements. But this is all a part of his belief that the Fed should have lowered interest rates faster and at much more drastic levels than we've seen them do. They've notably reduced interest rates now 3 times consecutively. But Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent advised Trump against that decision. And so this new investigation is likely a way to oust Powell without having to fire him. And his term as chair ends in May, but he notably could stay at the Fed until 2028. So this would make a way potentially for there to be a vacancy for President Trump to shape the Fed's monetary policy. But there's a very high bar that the Supreme Court has set for a Fed chair to be removed.
Justin, investors, executives, economists all like stability, right? This unprecedented clash between Trump and Powell would seem to totally undermine the idea of stability. How's the money class going to respond to this?
Very, very, very badly. So this is unprecedented. And let's cut through the legal jargon here. This was the president threatening the Fed chair with jail. He was doing it quietly. He didn't announce it. It's that the Fed chair came out and brought it out in public. Now, is this the first time a Fed chair has been threatened with jail for upsetting the president? In U.S. history, it's absolutely the first time. In global history, absolutely not. We've seen these tactics before in Argentina, Russia, Turkey, Venezuela and Zimbabwe. This is the stuff of tin pot dictators. This is the stuff that tends to precede a hyperinflation. This is the sort of story that never ends well. Now, we've seen Wall Street react badly early on, but not dramatically. And that's because of the old Trump two-step. No one knows if he's serious about this. If he's serious about it, there'll be an enormous market reaction. But they also expect the second half of the Trump two-step is the taco, that he'd back down and walk away and pretend nothing happened at all. So it's very hard to read anything from the market messages right now, because what we don't know is how serious the president is about this.
And Akayla, if this is about the Fed's renovation project, remind us of the background on that and why Trump is so focused on it.
Well, President Trump asked his Office of Management and Budget Director, Russell Vought, to look into this renovation last summer. And it really involves 2 1930s era buildings that were approved to be renovated during Trump's first term in 2017, when he also notably nominated Powell. Those costs have now grown to more than $700 million more than originally expected. It's now at about $2.5 billion in total costs. But the president has at times misrepresented those cost overruns, including during a tour of the renovations alongside Powell last year.
It looks like it's about 3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed. You just added in a third building is what that is. That's a third building.
Well, no, but it's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago. We finished Martin 5 years ago.
It's part of the overall work.
But it's not new.
Now, Federal Housing Director Bill Pulte has been one of the people who's championed this investigation. He's also pushed for the investigation into Lisa Cook on allegations of mortgage fraud. But Powell has repeatedly denied wrongdoing. He attributes those cost overruns to inflation, and he notably last year called for an inspector general report on these renovations.
That's right. Powell himself asked the Fed's inspector general to review the project this summer, and they shared an FAQ page about the renovation that explains some of the cost overruns, stressing changes in cost of materials, more asbestos and toxic contamination than expected, and also sharing that this was the result of consultations with review agencies. Barrett, how would that fit into any potential criminal case?
Yeah, I mean, it is appropriate for DOJ to investigate if they think there are allegations of corruption, fraud, waste, abuse. All of these things are, absolutely reasons that DOJ would start an investigation. What we're seeing here, though, is that this can't be looked at in isolation. This has to be looked at in combination with the president's efforts to both privately and publicly pressure the Fed to lower interest rates, and also his efforts to fire people that historically have been protected from firing. We know this is going to be looked at by the Supreme Court later this month. They're going to hear oral arguments in the case of Lisa Cook. So we have to look at all of this in context of every effort that the president has made over the last year to control the Fed, to bend it to his will, and to really publicly exert pressure. One has to then wonder if this DOJ investigation is one more of those efforts.
Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen just told our partners over at CNBC that this is extremely chilling for the Fed's independence. And Justin, you and I recently did a whole segment explaining why central bank independence is critical. Give us the rapid fire version, if you will. When a leader meddles with their country's central bank, does it lower inflation? Does it help affordability?
Right. So the core question is, do you want monetary policy run in the best interests of the American people or in the idiosyncratic political interests of the president? We could answer that as a question of economic theory, but we know what happens when a populist strongman takes over monetary policy. We've seen this happen in Turkey. President Erdogan in Turkey, just like President Trump, has enormous self-belief, eschews all experts and believes in the value of low interest rates. Well, he tried that policy, and what happened was inflation in Turkey went from very normal rates up to over 80%, and it's now back down to something around in the mid-30s. It's a terrible, terrible outcome. This is a bad path to walk down, and it's not going to lead to anything useful, either for the American people or for President Trump's agenda. The whole thing is pointlessly destructive.